What is the concept of blood purity in Harry Potter? How is this viewed by wizarding society?
Who defined which wizards were pureblood and which families carry this status?
Hey there, wizards! How's it going? Some families in the wizarding world were proud to flaunt their pureblood status. Others would love to be part of that status, but they're not.
And some others who were part of it didn't really care about it.
Before we get to know each of these families and some of their members, we need to understand how this concept of blood purity works from the perspective of those who defend this harmful ideology. A family is considered pureblood if all of its members, without exception, are wizards. The family members can't have any involvement with Muggle-borns, half-bloods, or even squibs. A family that has members who marry Muggle-borns is automatically considered half-blood. That's why some of the more radical families prune their family trees. If a wizard has at least one Muggle-born among their grandparents, they're considered half-blood, like Harry. Harry Potter is considered half-blood from the perspective of this ideology. That's because his mother is a Muggle-born, and his maternal grandparents are Muggles.
Muggle-borns, from this perspective, are the so-called mudbloods, people who come from a very large and entirely Muggle family line.
Some of these more radical pureblood families promoted marriages between members of their own family, since they limited their relationships to those who were pureblood. So, over time, these relationships became fewer and fewer.
And they practiced endogamy, which is when relatives marry, like cousin with cousin.
For example, Sirius Black's parents, Orion and Walburga, were first cousins. Those who were pro-pureblood ideology and fit the purity status considered themselves the equivalent of royalty in the wizarding world. They often looked down on those with different blood status, and many preached that Muggle-borns shouldn't even be accepted in the wizarding world. Of course, this is a very distorted view of reality, and based on a bunch of nonsense that has been proven to be false. The terms pureblood, half-blood, and Muggle-born are purely and exclusively political and social in nature. Today's goal is to learn about these families and explore the blood purity concept from their perspective. We'll discuss how misguided and prejudiced pureblood ideology is in another episode. A very important factor: not every family I'm going to talk about here supported the ideology of blood purity. To make it easier to recognize the pureblood families, some authors made a point of recording and publishing countless texts and books containing information about those they considered pure. For example, the book The Natural Nobility, A Genealogy of Wizards, lists all wizarding families that became extinct through the male line.
Because it wasn't enough for the purebloods to be completely prejudiced.
The family name also didn't continue through female heirs.
But some characters went against that. For example, Minerva McGonagall, who got married but didn't take her husband's name. She didn't change her name and kept her own.
And Hermione Granger, who also didn't change her name, and her children's last names included hers as well, not just the male part.
That is, Ron and Hermione's children are named Rose Granger Weasley and Hugo Granger Weasley. One of the documents most used by the defenders of blood purity ideology was the Pureblood Directory, written back in the 1930s, which listed the 28 truly pure families of Great Britain. According to the unknown authority who wrote this directory, which, although published anonymously, everyone believes was published by Cantankerous Knot,
these families became known as the Sacred 28, and among them is the Abbott family, which, although it was on the list back in the 1930s, occasionally had relations with Muggles or Muggle-borns.
Since, in 1991, Hannah Abbott, who was Harry's classmate and belonged to Hufflepuff House, was a half-blood. Hannah became part of Dumbledore's army, was a Hufflepuff prefect, and her mother was murdered during the Second Wizarding War by Death Eaters.
So, everything indicates that it wasn't a family that supported that ideology. In fact, Hannah Abbott marries Neville Longbottom. She became the owner of the Leaky Cauldron Bar, and later ended up studying and becoming a healer. She replaced Madame Pomfrey at Hogwarts. Neville was briefly an Auror before becoming a herbology professor, and now he's Gryffindor's head. The Avery family is also listed among the 28 sacred ones.
We know little about the Avery family, but what we do know shows that at least some of its members were adherents to this ideology. One of the Averys was one of the first Death Eaters who studied with Voldemort back when he was known as Tom Riddle.
And his son, who is known as Avery II, was also a Death Eater and studied during Snape's time. It's a family strongly associated with the ideology of blood purity.
But one of its members, Everett Avery, broke the tradition of being in Slytherin.
And he went to Hufflepuff, which was something very hard for him, and he refused to accept it. And he desperately tried to change houses to request a house transfer.
But since that wasn't possible, he stayed in Hufflepuff.
But he found himself as a Hufflepuff and accepted his identity, regardless of his family and what his family wanted.
The Black family is definitely one of the biggest examples of how this blood purity ideology works. One of the oldest and richest wizarding families in Great Britain. They had a very unhealthy habit of pruning their family tree. And how did they do that? Every family member who stood against the pro-blood ideology, like the son of Phineas Nigellus Black, who fought for Muggle rights, was cut from the family tree.
They were removed from there as if they never existed.
And other members also suffered the same punishments, like someone who married a Muggle-born, or even someone who was a squib. The person doesn't choose to be born that way. They're simply born unable to perform magic. But the great pureblood family, extremely traditional, cuts off that member as well, so as not to pollute the family, to not stain the family tree. I think one of the biggest examples of this is Sirius Black himself, who was burned off the tapestry, was removed from the Black family tapestry.
Simply because he didn't agree with the blood purity ideology, and also because he was the complete opposite, right?
He was the first in 7 generations to join Gryffindor instead of Slytherin, defying his family's principles. The Black family ended up being extinct on the male side, since Sirius Black and Regulus Arcturus Black were the last male heirs and died without leaving any descendants.
And the Black family has many connections with other families. For example, the Weasley family, the Longbottom family, the Potter family, the Crouch family, the Flint family, the Macmillan family.
It's a huge connection with many other families. Another family that is among the 28 sacred ones is the Bulstrode family.
They are predominantly defenders of the pureblood lineage and were quite prejudiced. Violetta Bulstrode married Sirius Black II to maintain the family's purity. Somehow, in one family branch, Emilia Bulstrode appeared and studied with Harry. Although the family is pureblood and one of the 28 sacred families, Emilia is a half-blood. This means a family member was involved with a Muggle-born, so Emilia Bulstrode has at least one grandparent who was fully Muggle.
The Burke family, also listed among the 28 sacred families, was known for being extremely prejudiced. One of its members, Elizabeth Burke, was headmistress of Hogwarts, and she was known for making pureblood students mistreat Muggle-born and half-blood students. Besides her, Caractacus Burke was one of the founders of Borgnenberg Shop.
That shop in Nocturne Alley that sells some pretty suspicious items, that provided a job to Tom Riddle after he graduated from Hogwarts. The Carroll family is also notable for their defense of pureblood ideology. They had prominent members in the Global Wizarding War, coordinated by Gellert Grindelwald in the 1920s, such as a witch who was quite active among Grindelwald's followers, whose least serious crime was killing that Muggle baby in Paris. But her descendants weren't far behind, because in the First and Second Wizarding Wars, during the period when Voldemort was responsible for all the terror in Great Britain, the siblings Alecto and Amico Carroll played their major roles as Death Eaters.
And in fact, they even took on teaching positions at Hogwarts when the school was taken over by Voldemort.
They committed several acts of torture against students while teaching. In fact, they taught Muggle studies. One of them taught Muggle studies, where they distorted the true reality of Muggles. They taught students that Muggles were mere animals, just pigs to be dominated. The only members of the Carroll family that we know of who are so far innocent and don't show much, because they're completely quiet, are the twins Hestia and Flora Carroll. who are part of the Slug Club.
It's not known what the relationship between the two and Electo and Emiko is.
Maybe they're nieces, maybe they're cousins, but they're extremely quiet. They don't say a single word, so there's no way to know what they're thinking and whether they followed that ideology or not. The fact is, they were part of the Slug Club, but that doesn't mean much, because many who were part of that club supported that ideology, like Lucius Malfoy himself. The Crouch family is also one of the oldest wizarding families in Britain and is listed among the 28 sacred ones.
Although we don't have information on whether they were supporters of the blood purity ideology.
We know that the Crouches were proud to be wizards. We know they were a family of status, a family that had a house elf, that had a lot of money.
So it seems like they were in a position where they were part of that. They didn't support the blood purity ideology at their core, but they didn't question being part of it either.
Barto Crouch Sr., during his most active political period, fought against Voldemort and the Death Eaters and hated dark wizards.
But his son, Barto Crouch Jr., we know was a staunch follower of Voldemort.
But I don't know if it was so much because of blood purity, and more because of his psychopathy, the fanaticism he had for Voldemort.
The Crouch family was also connected to the Black family through the marriage of Caspar Crouch, who married Cheris Black. They had 2 daughters and a son who are not identified. We don't know their names. Caspar Crouch might be Bartholomew Crouch Sr.'s brother, but that's uncertain. The Foley family is also listed among the 28 sacred ones, but they showed no sign of supporting pureblood ideology.
One of the most notable members was Hector Foley, Minister of Magic from 1925 to 1939. He served 2 terms but was not re-elected.
Because the wizarding community thought his efforts against Grindelwald at the time were not enough, so he ended up not continuing in the position.
Some family members come from other media, like games.
Grim Foley, a Hufflepuff, lost his parents in his 2nd year at Hogwarts.
He entered Hogwarts when Dumbledore was killed in 1997, then lost his parents during the Second Wizarding War. His parents were killed by Death Eaters. Later, he ended up making a career at the Ministry of Magic. Anyway, he was not at all a supporter of the ideology.
There's also Sullivan Foley, a character in the game Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The Flint family, openly supportive of the pureblood ideology, was also part of the Sacred 28.
It's a family that's connected to many other pureblood families, like the Blacks, for example.
And the connection comes through Ursula Flint, her marriage to Phineas Nigellus Black, the least popular headmaster of Hogwarts, who greatly favored Slytherin.
And they had a few children, and one of their sons was actually burned off the family tree for supporting Muggle rights. The Flint family's anti-Muggle feelings went beyond just personal boundaries.
Because even in the public offices they held, like the Minister for Magic Josefina Flint, who held the position from 1819 to 1827, she claimed that Muggle inventions, such as the telegraph for example, interfered with the use of wands, disrupted the use of wands by wizards.
That's completely untrue and makes no sense.
It was just to spread more prejudice against Muggles and make them oppressed by wizards in some way. And we see that the pureblood family ideology is still strong in the Flint family.
Because later on, Marcus Flint, who studied at Hogwarts during the same period as Harry, repeated all these prejudices.
When it comes to Muggle-borns, half-bloods anyway, one of the biggest examples of an extremely radical wizarding family is the Gaunt family, who came from 2 important families considered pureblood, like the Peverell and the Slytherin, which became extinct. Their names died out due to the lack of male heirs. The Gaunt family inbred extensively.
They married so much within their own family to maintain purity that it made the members mentally unstable, violent, actually causing the opposite of what they believed in.
They married to keep the blood pure and become stronger. But in the end, that made them weaker. It made them behave almost like savages. Morphino Gaunt is a clear example. The family valued this ideology so much that they lived in an extremely miserable way because they squandered the entire family fortune. For the sake of all this, they clung only to relics that had to do with purity, with their lineage, like Salazar Slytherin's locket, the ring that had belonged to the Peverell family. The Gaunt name also died out due to the lack of male heirs. The bloodline continued through Merope, who had Voldemort, had Tom Riddle, but with the name of his father's Muggle family, which was Riddle. So, the Gaunt name disappeared.
Also because the part of the family that migrated, that went to the United States of America, which is the part of Isolt Sayre, also didn't pass the name forward.
It's actually crazy to think that the founder of Ilvermorny is one of the descendants of the Slytherin family. She comes from the Slytherin family lineage. That's really cool, and she's completely different from the family. In fact, Isolt Sayre's daughter, one of the twins, she chose not to marry and not to have children so that the lineage wouldn't continue. But obviously she didn't know that the family had another branch, another lineage there in Great Britain, with the Gaunt family, which is where Tom Riddle came from. The Greengrass family was also a strong supporter of blood purity, but Astoria, who was Daphne's sister, Daphne's younger sister, who studied there during Harry's time, also during the period of the Second Wizarding War, Astoria lived through that period of terror, and she instantly regretted it after experiencing it firsthand, not only seeing how it was applied by her family, who promoted it, saying it was great and that, oh, blood purity, she once believed in when Voldemort is in power, but realized it was awful in practice. She and Draco decided to raise their son, Scorpius Malfoy, free from that ideology. Both regretted their earlier beliefs.
Even though he lived through that phase as a Death Eater, he also regrets it and raises his son outside of that mindset.
Which makes the grandparents, Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy, dislike Astoria, because they think she was kind of corrupting Draco's ideas, corrupting Draco's views. We're talking about the Malfoys, Lucius and Narcissa, who are hypocrites because they turned their backs on Voldemort.
But they were still extremely prejudiced.
The Lestrange family is also a very classic example of a radical pureblood family. They came from a French origin, and the family branched out, spread throughout Europe. Their line of thinking was practically the same as the Gaunt family, with extremely violent members like Rodolphus and Rabiston Lestrange, who took part in the torture, who tortured the Longbottoms until they were completely and irreversibly driven insane. It was a family that supported brutality, that supported violence against Muggles, against Muggle-borns, against half-bloods. And it's the family that Bellatrix, born black, ends up joining because she marries Rodolphus Lestrange to maintain blood purity. The Longbottoms are among the 28 sacred families, and they don't care at all about the blood purity ideology. They don't defend the blood purity ideology. They don't share that view. That doesn't mean they're not proud to be wizards or that they don't have a certain prejudice, because they were afraid that Neville Longbottom would be a squib, since he took a long time to show magic. But they don't go around preaching that. They don't go around spreading prejudice and excluding others. They were afraid that Neville would be a squib, which is a prejudice, but it's nothing like the way the families who defend that ideology behave there. The Longbottom family is connected to the Black family through the marriage of Harfang Longbottom and Caldeira Black. The Longbottoms were key in the fight against Voldemort.
Frank Longbottom and his wife Alice, who became a Longbottom by marriage, were both Aurors.
They fought in the First Wizarding War and were horribly tortured by Death Eaters. Their son, Neville Longbottom, was also crucial as the leader of Dumbledore's army during the Second Wizarding War. Very important and active against Voldemort, this terror and ideology. And it's important to point out that the prejudice in Neville's family about the fear of him being a squib comes from older people, right? It comes from his grandmother and great-uncles. Neville's parents were no longer like that, so that's important to clarify. The Macmillan family, which is also listed among the 28 sacred families, is connected to the Black family through Melanie Macmillan, who married Arcturus Black III. She was none other than Sirius's grandmother, that is, Orion Black's mother. So, Sirius was somehow a cousin of Ernest Macmillan, who was in Hufflepuff and was part of Dumbledore's army. That really unbearable Hufflepuff guy.
He claimed his family had been pure for 9 generations, and their family tree could confirm it.
They didn't seem to preach the blood purity ideology, but they also didn't seem to mind having pureblood status. The Malfoy family, of course, is obviously among the 28 sacred ones, one of the greatest examples of trickery. Not just trickery, but opportunism. He defended prejudice, pureblood supremacy. But it wasn't always like that, because the Malfoys got involved with influential and wealthy people, depending on the time period. When the law of secrecy, the statute of secrecy, didn't exist, they associated with Muggles. They associated with rich and powerful Muggles.
In fact, there was a member of the Malfoy family who tried to become a candidate for king consort to marry Queen Elizabeth I, but he was rejected.
Armand Malfoy, the first Malfoy, came to Great Britain during the Norman Conquest.
He was given land in Wiltshire, where the Malfoy family manor stands. The same manor that became Voldemort's headquarters during the Second Wizarding War.
So, the Malfoy family was always sucking up to whoever had power, whoever was in power.
And you can see that they're just another example of how blood purity, this ideology, is purely political and social. Because from the moment Muggles started being seen as enemies, after the statute of secrecy and magic, they ended up going like, no, Muggles are no good. That's right. Blood purity and all that. They always fit in wherever the power is.
The Malfoy family is also connected to the Black family through Narcissa's marriage to Lucius, right? Narcissa, who is Draco's mother, was Bellatrix's sister and comes from the Black family.
And also sister to Andromeda, who was cut off from the Black family tree because she married Ted Tonks, who was a Muggle-born.
This example of removing people from the family tree powerfully shows there's no such thing as a pureblood family, since there will always be a wizard who is a squib. They can't choose to be a squib. They're born that way.
He doesn't develop magic. Despite being the child of wizard parents, he lacks the ability to do magic. So, he didn't choose that. And then, the family that has a squib, that's seen as a sign of weakness. It's considered that way, right? Those with that ideology show weakness. See, that ideology is a lie. Pureblood wizards and families don't exist. The Knot family, one of the 28 sacred families, did value blood purity. They followed the same path as the Blacks and Malfoys. Knot was also an early Death Eater who studied with Tom Riddle.
One of the members, Theodore Knot, who was a student at the same time as Harry, who descended from that Knot, the first Death Eater, was arrested as an adult in possession of an illegal time turner, and was even arrested by Harry himself.
The Ollivander family is also listed among the 28 sacred ones. But there's nothing to say about them, right? Blood ideology. They didn't care about that at all. Their thing was just making wands in peace, being the best at wand making. And that's it, guys. There's no record of an Ollivander, a member of the Ollivander family, who was an extremist. The Parkinson family is among the sacred 28. That requires no explanation. They were very prejudiced and deeply committed to the ideology. Even Pansy Parkinson, once always with Draco Malfoy, wanted to hand Harry to Voldemort. Back then, before the Battle of Hogwarts and the invasion of Hogwarts, right?
Most importantly, people from these families held top positions in the wizarding world.
For example, Perseus Parkinson was Minister for Magic. He was the third Minister for Magic, and he tried to pass a law that banned marriage between wizards and Muggles. Only good people there, guys. Just fine folks. The Prewett family, which is one of the sacred 28, didn't seem to pay much attention to blood purity status.
Molly, Ron's mother, was born into the Prewett family and became a Weasley by marriage.
Her brothers, Fabian and Gideon Prewett, were members of the First Order of the Phoenix and fought against Death Eaters. They resisted Voldemort's reign of terror there and were killed by Death Eaters. The Prewett family was also connected to the Black family through Ignatius Prewett, who was Molly's uncle and married Lucretia Black.
The Black family was also linked to the Weasley family through Septimus Weasley, who married Cedrella Black.
And look, she was burned off the family tree for marrying a Weasley.
Which, despite being a pureblood family, is considered a family of blood traitors. Most likely, Septimus and Cedrella are Arthur's parents. The Rosier family, originally from France, is also one of the 28 sacred families.
And they also played a very active role in the global wizarding war. when Grindelwald was the one trying to dominate the Muggles through violence and rhetoric. One of his most active henchmen was Wanda Rosier, and a later generation of the Rosier family would also be part of a very nice little group, the Death Eaters. Like Evan Rosier, who was killed during the First Wizarding War by Alastair Moody, the family is also connected to the Blacks through Druella Rosier, who married Cygnus Black III, who are none other than the mother and father of Bellatrix, Andromeda, and Narcissa. They were so devoted to blood purity that they removed Andromeda from the family tree when she married Ted Tonks. The Rawl family was extremely supremacist and among the most radical in that ideology, and one of its members, Damocles Rawl, was Minister for Magic. And not just any minister. He was simply the guy who started using Azkaban as a prison.
So, he was the one who started throwing people in there with the Dementors. He was quite sadistic.
And generations later, Thorfinn Rawl was one of the Death Eaters. In fact, he was there when Dumbledore was killed in the Astronomy Tower.
Little is known about the Selwyn family, but they are also listed among the 28 Sacred Ones.
And the only thing we know is that there was a Death Eater with that last name during the time of the First and Second War.
And also that, back in 1891 of the wizards from that family was part of a group of magical creature smugglers.
Only good people. The Shacklebolt family is also one of the Sacred 28, and they are completely against the pureblood ideology. In fact, Kingsley Shacklebolt's history makes that very clear.
When he takes over the Ministry of Magic, he does a spectacular job eradicating pro-pureblood policies, the policies that favored the blood purity ideology. He removes the Dementors from Azkaban, changes a lot of laws, and reforms the ministry to fight the deep-rooted corruption that was there, and those laws that favored those families who had more money.
And one family listed among the 28 Sacred Ones, which is a mystery, is the Shafiq family.
They're here on the list. They're in the pureblood directory. But there's no information about any of their members, so we can't tell if they were pro-pureblood or not. The Slughorn family is also listed among the 28 Sacred Ones. Although they did value blood purity, they didn't harbor prejudice. It was something like, wow, we're purebloods. We're proud to be purebloods. But they didn't look down on Muggle-borns or half-bloods. They didn't treat them differently because of that. Not in any harsh way, but Horace Slughorn has some lines like, "Oh wow, I was really surprised that she was so smart coming from a Muggle family." He doesn't say that about Lily with any malice, but you can see that it comes from a pureblood wizard prejudice, like being surprised that a Muggle-born witch is talented, you know? Which is something that doesn't mean anything. A Muggle-born being talented. Like, Hermione is super smart, Lily was super talented, and Crabbe and Goyle, and Draco too, who came from pureblood families, are dumb, you know?
Being from a pureblood family doesn't guarantee success.
The Travers family, one of the 28 Sacred Ones, strongly supports blood purity ideology. The members are supremacist, and Travers, a Death Eater, was active in both the First and Second Wizarding Wars. But not all members of the family were like that. For example, the owner of Derwish and Bangs, which was a shop in Hogsmeade, was from the Travers family.
And also, Thorkel Travers was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement back in 1927.
And although his policies were violent and repressive, he tried, in this case, to fight against Grindelwald, against Grindelwald's ideology, against Grindelwald's movements.
He was a jerk, really arrogant and full of himself.
He acted like the big boss since he led the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Anyway.
But in the end, he wasn't a bad guy. He just didn't do things very well and had a bit of an inflated ego. The Weasley family, which most pureblood wizards look down on, is also one of the oldest pureblood families. The Weasley family is a very old British wizarding family. Unlike others, they don't hide that some relatives got involved with Muggles and Muggle-borns, and because of that, the family branched out into non-magical sides. And back in the 30s, when that pureblood directory came out, the Weasley family said it was absurd for that to exist. It was absurd for them to be there, because they weren't ashamed to say they had connections with Muggle-born people.
Muggles had joined their family through marriage.
And then they started being considered traitors because of that, because they were supposed to support that. They were supposed to support blood purity and the ideology. Since they didn't, they're blood traitors. That's in the eyes of those who value that ideology. The last of the 28 sacred families is the Yaxley family, which was also quite prejudiced. They were also connected to the Black family through the marriage of Lysandra Yaxley, who married Arcturus Black II. Corbin Yaxley, back in the 90s, was a Death Eater. He was appointed head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in the Ministry of Magic after Voldemort took over. These are the 28 families listed as the sacred ones, the entirely pureblood families, who are truly pureblood, according to this cantankerous knot, based on exactly what? In the voices in his head. But, obviously there are other families that weren't mentioned in this directory, who also have pureblood status, and, for some reason, aren't in the directory. For several specific reasons, actually. The Potter family, for example, the Potters come from a long line of wizards. Since way back from Iolanthe Peverell, Hardwin Potter, they've been. The Peverell family was a pure-blood, important wizarding family. Iolanthe Peverell later married Hardwin Potter, also from a line of wizards, uniting the two families. But since Potter is a common Muggle name, Potter is a very common name, very common. If you look it up, you'll see many real people named Potter.
That's why Cantankerous Knot left the Potters out of the Sacred 28.
There were several reasons why families were left out of this directory, but also because of the actions of its members, like Henry Potter, who was a member of the Wizengamot between 1913 and 1921. He publicly stood up against the Minister for Magic at the time, Archer Evermond, who said that wizards shouldn't get involved in the Muggle War, in the First World War.
And he was against that and fought for it. He declared that wizards should help the Muggles, you know, to stop this, to put an end to it.
But that ended up contributing to them not being included among the Sacred 28.
Because, wow, clearly a member of a wizarding family wanting to help Muggles.
Henry Potter, Fleamont Potter's father, was Harry Potter's great-grandfather. Besides these families I mentioned here, pureblood, right? There are the Belfort family, the Blishwick family, the Brown family, Crabbe, Forel, Cade, Gemp, Goyle, Hacksmith, Leroy, McDougal, Moreau, Moody, Perrow, Peverell, Slytherin, Prince, Sayer, Tremblay, Tripp, Trollsch, Victor, Volant, Urquhart, and Ward. All these families are also considered pureblood, but for some reason they're not among the Sacred 28. The Peverell obviously because they became extinct, and the Slytherin as well. The name became extinct, so they're not included there.
Some of these families I mentioned also come from France. They have French origins. But there, the Lestrange are also French, the Rosiers are also French, and they are among the Sacred 28.
For some unknown reason, these families aren't included in the Sacred 28. Despite these names, this huge list, and all this information about blood purity, do you know what all of this means?
Nothing, because in the end, there are no pureblood families. Every wizarding family is mixed, every single one.
And anyone who tries to hide that behind a speech about blood purity is prejudiced and a liar.
But we'll leave the talk about the origin of prejudice against Muggle-borns and how this whole blood purity thing became established.
How did Muggle-borns come to be seen as bad blood in the next episode?
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.
All information in this episode comes from official Harry Potter sources, like the books, extra text by J.K. Rowling, or official Wizarding World games. See you next episode at the Leaky Cauldron. Until then, mischief managed.